All right, guys, I'm going to try and rocket through 4 concepts about evolution in 15 minutes. So here we go. This is super condensed. All right, so what is evolution? Um, Essentially, all evolution is how animals change over time. They look different than their ancestors. Pretty easy to think about. We look totally different than our parents. So if you imagine that expanding through the 4 billion years life has been on this planet, it's pretty easy to imagine things could have changed drastically over that same period of time. All right, so Darwin was the original guy who figured out how this worked. There was another guy, Wallace, who also figured out how it worked around the same time. He was a little bit late, 20 years late. You guys should have read about that yesterday. So this is what Darwin noticed while he was traveling on the Beagle, which was a ship he sailed around the world on. All right, he noticed that organisms generally could increase, the population would increase if they had unlimited resources. The thing is, they do have limited resources, right? So populations tend to remain stable. Um, and he also noticed that all individuals in a population vary. It's pretty easy to think about. Once again, we all look entirely different. You may think something like penguins all look exactly the same, but they actually all vary. They all have different genetics that make them look different. He also realized that that variation had to be heritable. All right. So here was his big conclusion. This is how natural selection works. That variation would be passed on to children. The children born from those parents either would live or wouldn't live to pass on that variation to their children. So this is what we call survival of the fittest. Darwin never actually said that. It was just a way of trying to condense this idea to make it as simple as possible. So fitness in this case means actually reproducing and passing your genetic information on. So if you decide not to have kids, in the view of evolution, you are actually not fit. So the next thing that leads to adaptation. So he figured inheritable characteristics that are beneficial will tend to pile up or get more frequent in a population because those will be the individuals who survive and are able to pass on their genes. And finally, over time, all of those adaptations will increase in a population until you have an animal that is very well suited to live in its environment. So that's basically all natural selection is. All right. So Darwin, it's pretty incredible. He had no idea about genetics. He didn't know about DNA. He didn't know how inheritance worked. He didn't know about chromosomes or any of that stuff. He actually never read Gregor Mendel's work, even though he had a copy of it. So it's incredible he was able to figure all of this out because he didn't really have an idea of what genes were. But basically, the variation in populations falls into 3 categories, the ways that it can kind of change over time. So the first one is genetic drift. And this is basically just a random change in the frequency of a population or an allele in a population over time. So if you look at our example here, something rare like a white rose will tend to get bred out of the population just because there are less white roses. All right. The next one is gene flow. So this is how genes can kind of move in and out of populations as migration occurs. A classic example of gene flow in humans is when long isolated groups of people eventually contacted each other again. So classic example of this is the discovery of the New World by Europeans. They were long isolated from people in the Americas, and when they came in contact, there was a lot of gene flow happening. The last one here is sexual selection. So this is how alleles that make a mate attractive to another mate tend to pile up in a population. So these aren't necessarily things that help you survive, right? If you look at a peacock, it's like a giant target for a tiger to come and eat it. But peahens find peacocks attractive with those big, ridiculous feathers. So those traits also are inheritable and tend to accumulate over time. And finally, we come to the idea of genetic equilibrium. So evolution doesn't have to happen. Things don't have to change. If an animal is pretty well adapted to its environment, then it's not really going to change all that much over time. That's how we have the idea of living fossils. Okay, things that haven't really changed that much. If you look at crocodiles or alligators or sharks, they haven't really changed all that much. Or other animals like the coelacanth, they're pretty much unchanged. All right, so Patterns of evolution. The big one is speciation. So if we have gene pools that become separated from each other, over time those animals can continue to diverge away from each other, and that leads to new species. Um, Species can also go extinct. Classic example is the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. Currently, we are actually living in what is known as the sixth extinction because we are causing massive extinction all over our planet. Another one is gradualism, so things can gradually change over time, kind of how the peppered moth changed in response to industrialization in England. They became darker and darker and darker because the trees were covered in soot. And punctuated equilibrium is the idea that changes can happen extremely rapidly if the environment happens to change. So this evidence comes from the Burgess Shale, which was investigated by Stephen Jay Gould, and he was the one who came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium because right at the beginning of the Cambrian period, there's something known as the Cambrian explosion, where you have all of a sudden tons and tons of new forms of animals appearing almost instantaneously in the fossil record. Okay, instantaneous in the fossil record still means millions and millions and millions of years, but it's very quick from a geological standpoint. Another thing that can happen is adaptive radiation. So our really good evidence of this is how an animal can move into a certain population and then diverge over time into a whole bunch of different animals. And we can see this through structures that are the same throughout a bunch of animals. A classic example of adaptive radiation is the marsupial. One form of marsupial showed up in Australia or that region of the world and turned into a whole bunch of animals. Another example that we currently use is the fish known as a cichlid. They radiate into new species extremely quickly. All right, and convergent evolution, this is where unrelated species evolve similar characteristics because they live in extremely similar environments. So you can think about something like a bat and a bird. They both fly, but they don't share a common ancestor that recent in the history of the world, but they share a common niche. They do similar things, so that's why they look the same. And finally, my favorite example is coevolution. This is where two organisms change in response to each other and they form a very specialized relationship. Flowers and insects or their pollinators are the classic example of coevolution, where they are continuing to evolve together to become better adapted for their relationship. So if you think about orchids, or recently they just did a study on pollen and how pollen has evolved very well to stick to bees. All right. So what is our evidence? Well, we have evidence in paleontology. So this is the fossil record. We have tons and tons of transitional fossils, which is incredible because fossilization is very rare to happen. So it's actually amazing, the fossil evidence we have for evolution. Another one is biogeography. So this is how island species will be very similar to the species that are on the mainland that are close to them, and they've just slowly changed over time. The classic example is what Darwin saw in the Galapagos. Another one is embryology. So this is evo-devo, or evolutionary developmental biology. This is a new field in biology, and this is where you can look at the embryonic development of wildly different animals, and you can see that they actually look the same at certain periods in their development before they differentiate into what they are. So a human, a bird, and a reptile in the first couple weeks, they all look exactly the same. The other example of this at a genetic level are genes known as homeobox genes. So the same genes that control embryonic development in you and me actually turn on and control the organization of animals, including flies, other mammals, and even things like bacteria, fungus, and plants. We actually all have the same homeobox genes that help organize our body plans. And the evidence in anatomy. So you can look at anatomy and see that we have the same structure. So essentially my arm and a bat's arm are basically the same. They've just diverged over time to become more specialized for their functions, but they're actually just variations on a theme, and we have the exact same bones. They've just changed over time. And another one is vestigial organs. So that just means something, a vestige is something that's no longer needed. So it's things that we can look at on our bodies that show, hey, we don't have use for this now, but at some time we had use for this. So the wings of an ostrich or the tailbone that we have, as an example, we don't have tails, but we still have a vestige of a tail. Or if you look at the anatomy of a whale, whales don't have hind limbs that you can see, but they actually still have a pelvis and little remnant legs that are up inside their body, all right, from when they actually were a land animal. And another one is analogous structure. So this is once again convergent evolution, where we can see over time animals that have similar niches tend to evolve very similar body plans to accomplish the same task. All right. And the most recent and really good evidence we have right now is evidence in biochemistry. It's incredible when we actually look at the genetic level and we see the same genes across wildly different species, which shows that at one point we all had a common ancestor. All right. So we tend to look at similarities in DNA sequences or amino acid sequences, and you can actually see proteins that we use for a task will be the exact same proteins that maybe a yeast uses for the exact same task. So you're absolutely nothing like a yeast, but if you're doing a similar thing, you actually use the same DNA and the same proteins to accomplish that job. All right. And finally, we come to phylogeny. So this goes back to the cladograms that we did at the very beginning of the school year. This is how we organize all of these different evolutionary relationships and try and make sense of how time has passed and how animals have diverged. All right, so this is just how we classify organisms. You might remember this, our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or how I told you to remember it, drunken kangaroos punch children on family game shows. All right, so this is how we kind of organize species. So we make these things called a phylogenetic tree. What this tree does is it actually shows the evolutionary relationships between animals and how they change over time. So we classify them into different groups, and then it gets more and more and more specific over time. So originally we were doing this by physical characteristics. A lot of these trees are getting rearranged due to genetics. So we've actually found things that we think weren't that similar, and it turns out they're actually part of the same family. They've just diverged over time, but their genetics are actually extremely similar. And so this is what we're looking at, right? You can see here over time, you can see where a moss diverged first from a fern, a pine, or a rose, and then you can see here where then the fern diverged from a pine and a rose, and then you can continue to go that way. So a rose is more dissimilar from these things, and these things are going to be more similar to each other. You can also read it the other way, where a pine and a rose are going to be more similar because they're on the same tree, right? They share a more recent divergence. So here is the best way to read these things. So the speciation is showing you at every one of these branches, that's where you have a speciation event. All right, so at some point humans and birds very obviously diverged and we are no longer the same species. So other things like this, you might have an extinction that'll show up in there. You'll have a whole entire class of animals that maybe no longer exists. So something like, I don't know, mammal-like reptiles, they no longer exist. And you always start from the trunk, and that's going to show you these little points where everything meets up. That's going to show you where you had a common ancestor. So yesterday we were talking about human evolution and how we did not actually come from monkeys, but if you were to make one of these phylogenetic charts, you'd see that if you went back in time, we actually share a common ancestor with monkeys, and that's what confuses people. So we shared a common ancestor with birds. If we keep going back further, we shared a common ancestor with trouts or other fish, insects. You can keep going back all the way till you get to this point where you have the last common ancestor of all life on Earth, where at some point in time we all had the same great grandparents. All right, that is the super quick, really fast version of my favorite topic in all of biology. This is the overarching, unifying connecting theory of all of biology is genetics mixed with evolution. All right, bye.